Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the treasure state, Montana. The name Montana actually comes from the Spanish word montaña, which means mountain. Populations of elk, deer, and antelope outnumber the populations of humans in the state. 75 different species of dinosaur have been discovered in the state of Montana over the years. Paleontologists in the past in Montana have found fossils of Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, Diplodocus, and Tyrannosaur. And Montana is the only state in the country with a triple divide, which means basically it has 3 different watersheds depending on which part of the state you're in. So the rivers will either flow into the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean or the Hudson Bay up in Canada. Despite its immense size, Montana only has 1 congressional district, an at-large district covering the entire state. Incumbent Republican Greg Gianforte is not running for a 3rd term this year, instead opting to run in the Gubernatorial election, which we will get into later. So instead, facing off this year for the seat is Republican Matt Rosendale, who unsuccessfully ran to unseat Senator Jon Tester in 2018, and Democrat Kathleen Williams. To see how Montanans have been voting for their representatives over the past several years, let's pull up a line graph right now. And there you have it. We're looking at a graph that has looked pretty good for Republicans over the years. Obviously, from this data alone, we can determine that Montana has been exclusively represented by Republicans at the House level going back over the past decade. We do have those expected peaks in presidential years and those expected dips in midterm years. Until you get to 2018, of course, that was that big blue wave that we observed in the most recent midterm cycle, where Democrats were able to flip 40 seats in the House. Montana didn't quite get there, but they did outperform in 2018 relative to 2016 in terms of raw numbers for their House candidate, really closing that gap in a very dramatic way. And, causing people like me to take a bit of a closer look at Montana heading into November of this year, as Democrats have shown that they have some teeth in the state. Okay, let's toss that graph aside. I do expect Republicans to maintain control of the seat this year as well. It will be by a much more competitive margin than it has been in the past. I expect Rosendale to carry the seat by about 5 to 10%. Democrats are definitely closing that gap, but they're not. I don't think they're quite at the level they need to be at this point to flip this seat in Montana as of now. So let's make that result official and put it on our first map right now. Mark it. Up next, we have a Senate election in Montana. Incumbent Republican Steve Daines is running for a 2nd term this year, and he is facing off against Democratic Governor and former 2020 presidential candidate Steve Bullock in a race that many are seeing as being highly competitive this year, potentially a pickup for Democrats. Steve Bullock is, of course, wrapping up his 2nd term as governor this year, and he is term limited and was sort of pushed into joining this race kind of late in the cycle. A lot of people were thinking maybe he would not take it, but he is a very popular governor in a state that tends to split its tickets more often than your average state. So it's going to be very interesting this year. Anyway, to see how Montanans have been electing senators over the years, let's pull up some voter turnout ratios right now. And I think these numbers really drive the point home I just made, in that Montana is a ticket-splitting state for sure. The state currently has a senator from each party, so Steve Daines is the Republican, and Montana's other senator, Jon Tester, is a Democrat. Tester recently won his seat again in 2018. He enjoyed a voter turnout ratio of 109% versus just under 92% for his Republican opponent, Matt Rosendale. He also enjoyed a pretty hefty, even more dramatic voter turnout ratio advantage in 2012, of course, when that was the year that Barack Obama won his 2nd term as president. However, Steve Daines' first victory in 2014, he had the advantage in voter turnout ratio. 2014 was, really just a really great year overall for Republican congressional candidates nationwide, and Montana was no exception here. We do see, as a result of Montana's ticket-splitting nature, the advantage going back and forth between Republicans and Democrats every other election cycle when we look at the last decade. Makes it hard to predict how they're going to go this year, but anyway, we're going to do our best. Let's toss those numbers aside. Lastly, we do have to consider the approval rating of the incumbent. In this case, it is Republican Senator Steve Daines. Helping Steve Daines in this case is his approval rating. It is at plus 20 points in the state of Montana. A very good approval rating for a senator, especially a Republican senator, at this particular moment in time. I was wrestling with whether or not I should include Steve Bullock's approval rating in this calculation as well. because he does have a recorded approval rating, but I decided against that because that is his approval rating as a governor. It would be inconsistent with all the other calculations I've done so far in this series, so we're not considering Steve Bullock's approval rating in this calculation I'm about to do, but it is important to know that it is really good, like plus 30 points as of this video. But again, that's not factoring into this calculation here. So we're going to take what we know, be consistent with what we've done so far, give all our variables to Pollbot to calculate which Steve is going to take the Senate seat in Montana this year. Pollbot. And there is our result. We do have Steve Daines projected to win a second term this year, but by only 3.21%. A very tight margin for a state like Montana. Steve Daines' first congressional victory for Senate was in 2014. He actually won that seat by about 18 percentage points. So this is a massive improvement on Democrats' end, and largely a result of the projected raw House turnout numbers that we have for Montana this year as a result of the blue wave from 2 years ago. Had Steve Daines been underwater at all in his approval rating, it's very likely that this might have ended up going to Bullock this year in our projections, but as it is, we do have Steve Daines moving to a second term. Montana Democrats really landed a great candidate in Steve Bullock. He's making Republicans sweat to keep this seat this year. I don't know who else could have done could have gotten it this close. So anyway, but he did just fall short. So now we are going to make this result official and put it on our senatorial map right now. Mark it. Up next, we have a gubernatorial election in Montana. Steve Bullock, the Democratic incumbent, is obviously term limited and not running again this year, as we just covered. Instead, we have Democratic Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney running on the Democratic ticket this year for governor. He is facing Greg Gianforte, the Republican candidate and current representative of Montana's at-large district. Interesting side note about the governorship in Montana, the state actually has not elected a Republican governor in 20 years, so keep that in the back of your head as we go through this. Now let's pull up some more voter turnout ratios to get some more insight on how Montanans have been electing their governors over the last decade. And here we have some numbers that are showing both of Steve Bullock's past gubernatorial races, the voter ratios that he got from both of those years. And as you'll see right off the bat, he just had pretty great advantages both of those times. He was, of course, running after a previous two-term Democratic incumbent governor was term limited and not running again. And so he was kind of riding high on the wave of Democratic enthusiasm for the governorship of Montana, and it certainly continued into his second term as well, into 2016, even though Republicans won the presidency that year. Just further evidence that Montana loves to split its ticket. You know, they elected Trump 4 years ago, they elected Steve Bullock 4 years ago, they elected a Democratic senator to another term 2 years ago, and Republican governor 4 years prior to that, so it's just kind of all over the place. But they have been pretty consistent in how they've been electing governors, as evidenced here, and knowing that they have not elected a Republican in 20 years for the position. So now we have those numbers in our head. Let's toss them aside. There is no approval rating to consider in this calculation because there is no incumbent running in the race. So we're just going to give two numbers to Pollbot here. First, our projected raw House turnout numbers matched up with those the projection of those voter turnout ratios that we were just looking at to calculate whether or not we think the Democrat or Republican will win the seat of Montana's governorship this year. Pollbot. And there's your result. It's actually a lot better for the Democrat than I personally expected. Montana's going to be somewhat competitive this year, I imagine, for the governorship. Steve Bullock not running, but we have projected here now that his lieutenant governor is going to win the seat by an 11.49% margin of victory. This would be a bit of a surprise to me, to be honest. I mean, historically, in the 21st century, Montana has been very kind to Democratic gubernatorial candidates, but we're in unprecedented times this year, and it's hard to say for certain Mike Cooney has this much leeway, but he is the lieutenant governor of a very popular term-limited governor running for the Senate seat this year, so that will certainly play in his favor this November, I believe. While it may not be this definitive a victory, we are projecting the Democrat to maintain control of the seat this year in Montana, so let's make that result official and put it on our gubernatorial map right now. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Montana is a state that last voted for a Democratic presidential candidate in 1992 when they broke for Bill Clinton over George H.W. Bush. The state more recently did vote for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton by about a very definitive 20% margin of victory, awarding Donald Trump 3 Electoral College votes from the fourth largest state in the country. To see how Montanans have been electing presidents over the last decade, let's pull up some more voter turnout ratios right now. And here we have some more numbers that, further my belief that Montana is pretty consistent in how it elects certain offices, but they don't always conform with each other. You know, the state obviously favored Democratic governors in the previous section, but here we can see they definitely favor Republican presidential candidates. Mitt Romney had the advantage in enthusiasm relative to House candidates in 2012, and then Trump again over Hillary Clinton in 2016, actually by a slightly larger margin over Hillary Clinton than Mitt Romney had over Barack Obama. This is definitely good news for Trump, and if ratios like these hold true with our expected slightly higher turnout for Republicans at the House level, that is certainly good news for him. But there is one more factor we must consider. So let's toss those numbers aside and consider the approval rating of the incumbent. In this case, it is President Trump. Interestingly enough, in Montana, he's at -1 point. He's just barely under zero. So just 1% more people, 1% more of the population of Montana disapproves of him than approves of him. At the end of the day, a margin that close to zero will hardly have any effect on our calculations at all. But anyway, we're going to give all of them to Pollbot right now to calculate who we think is going to carry the state of Montana in the presidential race this year. Pollbot. And there's your result. It is another victory for Trump in the state of Montana. It's only 9.29% margin of victory. At first glance, this would seem like good news for Republicans. This is not particularly good news, though. Remember, he won the state of Montana 4 years ago by 20%, so that's cut in half here just 4 years later. I attribute this mostly to the very good turnout numbers from Democrats 2 years ago. That affects our projections for raw turnout numbers for this year, and that's certainly at play here. His approval rating below zero, albeit just by 1 point, is certainly not helping his case either. However, Trump would have to be way underwater in terms of approval rating for this, for Montana's 3 Electoral College votes to really be in play this year. I don't see it happening at this point. So anyway, let's make that result official and put it on our presidential map right now. Mark it. So all the results are now in for the state of Montana. We've seen no flips at any level, actually, but pretty noticeable movement towards the left in the state. Let's talk briefly about the future of Montana by pulling up an old line graph and some new ones. Okay, first let's take a bit of a closer look at raw House turnout numbers for the state of Montana here. We're going to look specifically at the slope values that you can see for both of those equations on this double line graph here. For Republicans, it's that value 10.8. For Democrats, it's that value at 22.3. Basically what that means is on average every 2 years, or every election cycle in Montana, when you look at the last decade as a whole, Republicans have been increasing their voter turnout by 10,800 votes versus Democrats improving numbers of 22,300 votes, meaning that Democrats are closing that gap over the last 10 years by an average of just under 12,000 votes, largely driven by their great performance in 2018 when they really closed that gap for the first time in a long time. This is definitely good news for Montana Democrats heading into the future, so definitely keep that in the back of your mind when we look at these other 3 line graphs here. If we first look at the senatorial to House vote ratio graph, these are actually estimates for the rate of increase or decrease in those voter turnout ratios I was using earlier in my calculations. They kind of measure enthusiasm to a certain degree, and we do see that gap closing in Republicans' favor. They're catching up slightly, or Democrats are losing enthusiasm. This could slightly be driven by the fact that Democrats did have very good turnout numbers for House candidates, and Jon Tester did not gain votes at the same rate, which could account for his slightly lower turnout ratio 2 years ago than he had in 2012. This is probably a minor factor in our projected victory for Steve Daines this year for the seat. And then when we look at the gubernatorial voter ratio estimates here, that's just great news for Democrats in the state. We consistently see Republican gubernatorial candidates underperforming the House candidate running in the state, and it's the opposite case for Democrats. Steve Bullock just did much better than either Democratic candidate running in 2012 or 2016. This is definitely a play in our projected victory for the Democratic candidate for the seat this year. And lastly, when we look at the estimates for presidential to House ratios, we do see negative slopes for both parties, actually, which basically means Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were both less popular than Barack Obama and Mitt Romney in 2012, respectively. But the difference in voter turnout ratios between parties remained relatively consistent going from 2012 to 2016, and will be pretty close to where it has been in the past this year for Trump and Biden. Okay, so what does all this mean? Let's toss those graphs aside. I'll give you my final consensus on the state of Montana. I do believe it is trending slightly more Democrat. Montana is definitely a ticket-splitting state. They've got, representation from both parties pretty evenly laid out in the state. But if trends like these continue that we've observed in this video today, I would expect Republican victories to be less assured going into the future than they have been in the past. That could be trouble for Steve Daines. I mean, it's trouble for him this year, to be perfectly honest, but it could be bigger trouble for him in 6 more years when he has to run for a 3rd term, if he chooses to do so. Also, let's not ignore the fact that Joe Biden is we projected Joe Biden to cut Trump's margin of victory in half from what it was 4 years ago. That is pretty extraordinary. The numbers just point to a leftward-leaning trend in the state, definitely helping Democrats in the years ahead. Let's also consider the possibility that Montana might be getting another congressional House seat this year after the conclusion of this census, essentially doubling them. So it would go from having 1 at-large to 2 districts, and its influence in presidential elections would mean it would have 4 electoral college votes in the next decade. That just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter and update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting, and I'll see you next time.